designation is a little bit different from that because there typically the state will have criteria for you to be able to list yourself as a structural engineer. They might say that you've had to pass the SE2 exam back in the day or the new SE exam to list yourself. But there's not a practice requirement. You don't actually have to have that to practice for most structures. Okay? The next thing is called the Partial Practice Act. That's an act where to do structural engineering, you have to have an SE after your name, except what they'll do is they'll say, okay, you have to be an SE to do these types of structures. And typically what you'll find is states that have a Partial Practice Act will tell you, well, okay, buildings where our kids go to school, we want the, so Category 3 and Category 4 occupancies, large assembly buildings, and then buildings that would be catastrophic if they, collapse, surgery centers, missile defense, big electric plants, stuff like that, stuff that just really can't fail, needs to be going 100%. So some states are limited to that. It's really funny, you look at the state of California, I'm registered there as a structural engineer, right? And so prior to that, I was a CE, because that's how you get registered. And as a CE in California, I could design a 40-story office building in the middle of downtown San Francisco, but I couldn't touch a 1-story police station. It was really interesting in school, so they had those kinds of caveats. And I think they're going to very shortly change the regulation so that there's a building height above which you can't, you have to have the SC for as well. They want to get to the point where it's every structure, but it's difficult because people have been designing a certain way for many, many years under certain circumstances, and all of a sudden if I come along and say, hey, you are not allowed to design this type of building that you've been designing for the last 30 years, I mean, that's heresy. No one's going to allow that to happen. So it's a process that we have to go through. And then as you can imagine, then there's a thing called a Full Practice Act, and that's where any structure that you do, you have to be registered as a structural engineer. And like I said earlier, Hawaii and Illinois are the two cases for that. Okay, so Doug, did that answer the questions you had on the different types? Okay, yes. Just want to make sure, and if you have any others, don't hesitate. I'll do the best I can to explain them. So what are the states doing? So we talked about the full practice restriction. That's Illinois and Hawaii. Okay, partial practice would be California, Guam, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington. These are states, Utah and Washington being the most recent, that have enacted legislation to have an SC license out there. The most recent of those was Utah, and you guys haven't met Barry Arnold, right? I guarantee you, if you came down and talked to your guys, you'd follow him into battle anywhere. It's just, I call him Preacher Barry, because he's just very good at explaining it and getting totally juiced up about a movement or a cause. But he was the guy who literally, they didn't have the money to do anything with lobbyists like we're going to have to do. He single-handedly went down to the legislature in Utah with a couple of his guys, and they just spent nights and days and time with the right people and eventually got it passed. It would not work here because of the way the process is set up, as I've learned, but my hat's off to him because he was able to do that. Okay, states that have title designations, Idaho and Nebraska. So I'm registered in Nebraska as a civil engineer. I tried to get registered as a structural engineer, but again, because I only have the SC2 exam and I don't have the way I got my SC out in California is I passed the structural SC2 exam back when they used to have that, SC1 and SC2. And then the California structural seismic exam. So I took those 16 hours of exams. Well, that's not recognized in Nebraska to have the title of structural, so I can't have that there. They're lost, right? Anyway. And then roster designation, as I was talking about earlier, Massachusetts being the example of that, Oklahoma, Texas, a bunch of those states I'm registered in. So let's just give you an idea where the other states are. And we want to be here. We want to be in the Full or Partial Practice Act, because that's where I think it makes a difference. Okay. The other ones are nice. It's a place to start, but it just takes a long time to get from one of those further up the line. Okay, so what are other states doing? Who else is working on this? Okay, well, this is a list of states, some of which you recognize, others that you might not be aware of, that are working on E Licensure. Who's the closest right now? I think Florida, Georgia, and Texas are the closest. And I think Texas may be leading the pack right now. We had a lot of progress up till about a year and a half ago. And then when we came to the sad realization that a lobbyist was the only way to go and the kind of money we were going to have to raise, that's when we kind of swallowed really hard to figure out how we move it forward. California is looking to expand the building types. Connecticut's looking to do something. Maine, even people in Ohio. But on a regular basis, different states are looking at this issue. I mean, the selling point to me is NCES has an exam for structural engineering because the structural engineering community and the engineering community in general said we need to do this. It's not something that was just made up by structural engineers to help structural engineers. There was a need in the industry because people realized that exam just didn't cut it. Okay. All right, so let's talk about things that have not gone well. Well, here's what I was talking about earlier. There's a Bergman Plaza in Jacksonville, Florida. I remember going into work one morning, listening to the news, and this thing's about a half mile from my office. And as soon as I heard about it, I was like, oh my God. So I took a walk over and kind of just got to some places where I could get close, but not being search and rescue certified, I wasn't obviously able to go in there, and nor would I wanted to, but just to go there and to see, equipment and cranes and people and dogs and whatever they could do to try to get people out of there. And I think there were 10 or 15 people trapped, and they eventually got them all out except for the one, Willie Edwards, I told you about earlier. But that's been going on since 2007. So that's the most recent example. Back in the early 80s, there was a Harbor K condominium in Cocoa Beach, which many of you may remember, but there's a flat place reinforced building structure that was designed by an engineer who used to work for NASA because of the downturn in the economy at NASA. Came in, and people work at NASA are bright people. He read the building codes. He did the analysis. He thought he understood it well enough, except that there was a concept that he didn't quite grasp, and that's two-way shear. He didn't get the two-way punching shear right, and that's what happens here. Okay, and it wasn't because he tried to do something incorrectly. He didn't know basically what he didn't know. All right. There's Turner Agricultural Civic Center. It was supposed to be designed for 140-mile-an-hour wind, and it actually ended up twisting into a collapse with winds that were much lower than the design loads. Imagine if it had been used at the time. And then this is kind of a smaller one, but Sea-Base Boy Scout Camp. And it's really not clear in the photos, but these columns are actually supposed to be vertical, so that roof that cantilevered out there is kind of leaning down. But it took me several tries to look at the photographs to realize that that's what had happened there. Fortunately, nobody there was injured. So we don't have a lot of. Yes, sir.
The one in Cocoa Beach, I was under the impression that it had to do with shoring and reshoring. It wasn't.
No, it's not the case. That's not the case. Okay. Now, there's also with the Bergman Plaza, there was also some shoring and reshoring stuff that was done incorrectly. Okay, that probably caused the collapse to occur the day that it did, but it was later determined. It hasn't been publicly announced. I just happen to know engineers, so you didn't hear this from me. But what they also found is that the overstress in some of the elements was such that over time this collapse would have occurred, and you can almost say it was a blessing that it occurred under construction because one person died and not a bunch of people after they were living there died. I don't know where there's a good answer in any of that. If you look at on the national level, you guys probably remember the Hartford Civic Center. There's a whole bunch of people in there for either a college basketball game. Literally within hours after them having left, the roof collapsed. So just imagine a couple hours earlier. Okay, 10-day snowstorm. The Hyatt Regency, anybody not remember this? I mean, this was just a very, very painful thing to watch. It happened right after I graduated from college. But, these are people trying to make good decisions under the pressures of building stuff. I mean, we go through this all the time. Nobody did this on purpose. Jack Yellen was the engineer. I mean, just an awful thing to think that he was responsible for 115 or 114 people not being alive. The Bailey's Crossroads Skyline Plaza. Any of you guys familiar with that? That's basically okay. Basically, that building pancaked. Here's one of the biggest causes for discussion on progressive collapse. Here's something that happened on one floor that continued down the building. It caused an obscene amount of damage for what the actual failure was. The failure was up high, and then it predicated its way down the building. And so this is one of the things when we talk about progressive collapse. You want to make sure that if you do have a failure in a location, it stays isolated. I think there's another one. No, that's it. So we do have examples, but I don't know if there's a slide on this later on. So a lot of people are like, well, yeah, but that's 4 buildings, and what's the span of that? 30 years that I just showed you, right? So what, people have to be dead before we do something about it? I mean, that's literally what happens in some of the conversations. We need to be counting bodies before it makes a difference. I don't think it's a profession that's where we want to be. So that's one of the reasons I'm really passionate about this, okay? And I hope that when you walk out of here, you feel about it the same way I do. Nobody should not be able to go home to their families at night because of something any one of us did as a structural engineer. We just can't allow it as a profession, okay? And the only people who are going to beat that horn is us, okay? And we can get people to support us. So the big question for most people is, what about the people that are PEs right now? How do they get affected? They're not going to be. All right, bottom line is this: we're going to have a thing set up so they'll be able to sign an affidavit, attest it with their signature, they've been practicing structural engineering, and they're going to be transitioned or grandfathered in as an SC. Now, that will be not portable, but it will be usable in the state of Florida. So if you get an SC in Florida by this clause, you're not going to be able to write a letter to California and say, hey, guess what? I'm an SC here in Florida. I need to be an SC in California. They'll see right through that. Okay? Yes, sir.
How is that good? The whole point is to weed out folks that shouldn't be practicing?
Right.
Or doing the stuff that we're doing?
Well, think about it. I agree with you, and that's exactly where I was 3 or 4 years ago. I'm like, what the hell? Why are we... If we don't do it this way, what this does on day one is it starts the clock ticking. And somewhere between 10 and 15 years from now is when the profession actually is better, because all the young people coming up